radioisotope dating. This is one of the things that the scientists will tell you is evidence that the Earth is old. All right, and because we can do radioisotope dating, and it'll tell us that. But how old is it really? We really don't know. At least not, that's what they're going to say. We're going to talk about a couple of definitions. Isotopes is an element that has the same number of protons. That's what makes it the element it is. For example, carbon got 6 protons in its nucleus, all right? But it can have 6 neutrons, 7 neutrons, or 8 neutrons. And that makes it carbon-12, which is what most carbon is, carbon-13, which is another one, and the one that you hear the most about, carbon-14, which is radioactive, okay? And radioactive is an element that's not stable. Basically, it's got too many elements, or too many neutrons and protons in its nucleus, and so it spits out either particles or energy to get itself to a stable state. So carbon isotopes we just talked about. So you got carbon-12, 13, and 14. And so you look in here in the nucleus, and you see there's an extra neutron, there's 2 extra neutrons. That's what makes carbon-14 radioactive, is it's got too many neutrons and there's too many pieces in its nucleus to be stable. All right, uranium-238, this is one of the big ones that they use for dating. Its half-life is 4.5 billion years, but you can see it takes a long time to get to something stable. And each time it kicks out either an electron, which is called a beta particle, or a helium nucleus, which is called an alpha particle. And you can see during its long decay chain, it kicks out 8 alpha particles and a bunch of other things, and it changes to a different element if it kicks out protons. And so it gets finally down to lead-206. So there's a lot of stuff that's missing from 238 down to 206. That's a lot of particles that disappeared. All right, and there are 3 elements that it kicks into, or turns into when it decays, called polonium, which we're going to talk about, which is evidence of rapid decay. Yes? Yes, it is. Radon-222, yeah, that's the one that you get a detector for. So, radiohalo is a microscopic spherical shell or discoloration within minerals, such as biotite. They occur in granites or other igneous rocks. Igneous rocks are rocks that were formed as a result of heat, magma, if you will, lava. All right, magma if it's inside the earth, lava if it's outside. All right, and they cause damage, the occlusion of minute radioactive crystals in the host crystal structure. The things like biotite and other parts of granite have radioactive materials in them, and they decay in there. And if you look back, you can look at the half-lives of these things. It's like 3 minutes, a couple of microseconds, and 140 days. Okay, so fairly short half-lives. So this is what radiohalos look like in granite. What you see are these discolorations. All right, and that's evidence of decay, rapid decay, in a solid material. All right, now they used to think that all of this stuff happened while the granite was molten and stuff in the middle of the earth, but that's not how it happens. It happens in a solid material, which means that the decay happens fairly quickly. Fission tracks are a damage path left by a fission product. Now, uranium-238 will split. You got to use a really fast neutron to make that happen, but the one that really is good, the one that we use in nuclear power plants, is an isotope called uranium-235. It's got 3 less neutrons. But that one will fission with what we call thermal neutrons. Thermal neutron is still going pretty fast, 2,200 meters per second, but that's supposedly in thermal equilibrium with its environment. But that's the one we use at, like Fermi 2, to make power with. Now, someone asked me one time, how does nuclear fission work? Put your hands together, rub. You want to increase power? Rub harder. That's how it works. It's real simple. Basically, when you split that big atom, it rubs against its neighbors, and it heats them up. They're in a pellet about this big. That's equal to a ton of coal. That's a pile 4 foot by 4 foot by 4 foot. That's how much energy is in that little pellet. That's where the bang for the buck is in nuclear. But basically, to increase power, you increase the fission rate, you're rubbing harder, you're making that pellet heat up, you've got it in a metal tube, you run water by it, extract the heat, run it through a turbine, which is connected to a generator, and voila, you got lights. So that's how it works. All right, so basically that's what happens with fission. You take a big atom, you smack it with a neutron, it gets unstable and it breaks into other particles, energy, and sets out some more neutrons to create more fissions. All right, these are fission tracks in a element, or a piece of rock called apatite, which is part of granite. So you see a fission event where you see these things flying apart, then you see the product tracks. So that's, once again, evidence of fairly rapid decay because it's in a solid material. All right? So how do secular geologists date rocks? They date them determined by what they call superposition. And that is usually the older rocks are on the bottom, younger rocks are on the top. So if we remember this from the last time we talked about the flood, all of this, that's 15,000 feet of sedimentary rock from the bottom of the Grand Canyon to the top where Bryce Canyon is, okay? So the older rocks are down here at the bottom in what they call the Cambrian, and the upper rocks are up here, what they call the Eocene, okay? So just from a superposition, you can say all those rocks were laid down one after the other. And if you look at them, you go out west, you can see they're all laid down, but they're pancake flat. There's not a lot of time between down here and up there, basically about a year. All right. So absolute dates are determined by radioisotope dating. You use uranium, lead, rubidium, strontium, or if you're going to date volcanic data, volcanic stuff, you use what's called krypton argon. Not krypton, I mean potassium argon. K is potassium. Don't ask me why. That's what they came up with. All right, so what happens in radioactive decay is you start out with a certain amount of parent, and it decays away over a certain number of what are called half-lives. A half-life is what happens when half of that material decays. So one half-life, if you start out with 1 gram here, after one half-life, you got a half a gram. And another half-life, you got a 1/4 gram, and you just keep on going down until you got virtually nothing detectable left. Okay? Now, here's basically the types of isotopes and radioactive things that they use to date things and what they use to date. All right, uranium-238 from 10 million to 4.6 billion years. Zircons and uranite. Uranite is the ore that you find uranium in. All right, potassium, argon, basically biotite, hornblende, and other volcanic rocks. Rubidium and strontium, biotite. These are also things that are found in granites, okay? Then you get down here to our buddy, carbon-14. It's found in wood, charcoal, bones, tissues, all kinds of stuff, okay? So why do they use all these really long-lived isotopes? Every one of those things is in millions and billions of years, all right? Because they give really long ages to the rocks. So why do they want really long ages to the rocks? Because they need the long ages for evolution to have occurred. So anything that gives them long ages is like, yeah, we want that, all right? Are they accurate? No. All right, now, there are 2 things that we're going to look at. One down here at the bottom, underneath in the basement rocks, the diabase sills, and the other one is Uinkaret Plateau lava flows. This is up on the north rim. There was volcanic activity, and that spilled lava down over all of this stuff. Now, they've tested both of those in the Grand Canyon. Samples of the basalt were sent to different labs, and the results, well, one of them said 516 million years. These are the same sample now, okay? 1,100 million years and 1.5 billion years from the same samples from 3 different labs. You got 3 different results, all of which are old, and they're going, yeah, that's good, but they don't agree with each other from the same sample. That's not good. All right? The samples of the Uinkaret Plateau basalt from the top of the north rim were sent to analysis along with this stuff And they came up with 506 million years, nearly identical to the 516 million years for the lava flow supposedly 500 million years before it. So you're looking at that going, oh my goodness, this is not good. These are not giving us the stuff we're looking at. It's given us long ages, which is okay, but it's also given us discrepant dates from the same samples, which is not okay. All right? So how does this work? Well, you start off with uranium and you want to get to lead. All right, so that's what you got. So the first thing is you assume that you know how much of this you have to start with, so that you know when you get to the bottom how much daughter product you've got. So you got parent and daughter, all right? The assumption is that you know how fast this stuff decays. And they assume that all of this stuff down here was produced from what was up here. Okay? And so finally you get to the dating part, which is determining where you are in this. How much of this is decayed will tell you how long it's been decaying. Okay? So the decay equation looks like this. The amount of atoms at any time t is equal to what was at the beginning times an exponential times the decay constant times time. That'll tell you, if you know how much you have here and you know what the decay constant is and how long it's been decaying, it should tell you how many atoms that you should see at the end when you start measuring. So that's what N naught is, the initial number of atoms, the decay constant in time. If you solve for t, you wind up with this, where you take the log of the ratio of these two but divided by the decay constant, and that will tell you how long or how old it is, basically. So that's just quick math. So the assumptions are that you know the number of parent atoms, you know that the decay rate, and you know that it hasn't changed. The number of daughter atoms are all produced by the parent, and it's a closed system, so you don't have anything coming in and going out to kind of mess things up. So what's reality? Reality is that you don't know how many you started with, because this is supposedly 500 million years ago, so you weren't there to measure it. The evidence of decay rate lambda has not been constant in the past. That was part of the discovery that the people that were doing what's called the rate, radioactive age of the Earth. It was a study that was done by guys from Institute for Creation Research. They used labs, regular scientific labs. They did this, and they did the checks and everything. They didn't tell them what they were looking for. They just said, analyze this and tell us what's here. Usually, and the people had a hard time with that, because typically when you send them in a sample, you kind of give them an age range that they're looking for. And if they want to keep doing business with you, they give you an age range that's kind of in there where you sort of preloaded them, which is kind of a shame, because that's not really scientific, but that's how business is done. So, what they came up with was that there was evidence that the decay rates have not been constant in the past. There's no way to know if the number of daughter atoms were all produced from the parent, and if you're thinking about a system in nature, there's no such thing as a closed system. If it's open to the sun and moon and rain and wind and stuff like that, it's not closed. So stuff can either be leached out or brought in or whatever, and so you really don't have this nice thing which works real good for that old equation there. All right, so they date relatively things by looking at stuff up at the top, saying that's younger and that's older. They've done some dating of these volcanic ash deposits, and they kind of get an idea of where those are. But now you look at these, they're all millions of years, okay? And so the krypton-argon dates provide those date ranges. So why do we use lava flows? Well, because they're everywhere. The Columbia River Basin in Washington and Oregon, you got the Huckleberry Ridge and Lava Creek beds in Yellowstone, and you got Long Valley beds in California, you got the San Francisco Peaks in Arizona. They're everywhere. There's evidence of volcanic activity all over the place, so it's a good thing to use. Now, this is the San Francisco Peaks. There's a cinder cone and a lava bed. There's the cone, there's the lava flow. This is overhead. This is now down at ground level, so you can get an idea. This is about a 5.5 foot tall person. You can see how thick the lava bed is and where the cinder cone is. So that's a pretty good sized piece of geology there. All right, in Yellowstone, the two largest volcanic events in the entire country's history happened there, both at the same place, where Yellowstone Lake is. Now, if you go into Yellowstone, you come up, you drive up, and then you drive down into the park. You just drove into the caldera, which is what's left after the volcanic activity. Most of Yellowstone Park is inside the caldera, all right? The first one was Huckleberry Ridge, which was the biggest one. You got about 585 cubic miles of material. Now think about a cubic mile as 1 mile on a side, it's a cube. That's a lot of material. The second one was Lava Creek, was about half that size, only 240 cubic miles of material. The third one is Long Valley, only 145 cubic miles of material. Now Long Valley is kind of interesting because it didn't leave a caldera. Basically, it was a big rip. It was called, they called a ring fissure, and basically it was just a big rip in the surface that, and instead of like you think of a volcano as this big, peak with stuff spewing out of it, this was like about 100 miles long, spewing stuff out of it. Just a big rip in the surface. Now, way over here is Mount St. Helens. That's the biggest event that we have seen in our history, in recent history, was Mount St. Helens. It was about 1/10 of a cubic mile of material, and that was pretty damaging. So if you drive to Yellowstone, you can see what happened. You can see where'd it go? Huckleberry Ridge and the Lava Creek. What it left are these rhyolite deposits. These are hundreds of feet thick with a basalt cap. That's basically lava on top of it. And you can see this driving around in the park. It's massive amounts of volcanic activity, just to give you an idea. Okay, now, accelerated radioactive decay, this is part of the rate thing. The radioactive halos and biotite and zircons have short half-lives. They decay in solid rock, not molten rock. And what you can see when you look at these things, you can tell by the size of them and the coloration what they look like. And we looked at some of them. This is uranium halo. Polonium-210 is in there, 140 days. Polonium-218, 3 minutes. Polonium-214, 15 microseconds, all right? When you see all of these things, that stuff's happening really quick, all right? So you can see that the decay of uranium-238 is a lot faster than what people thought. That's the evidence for decay rates not being constant. You see polonium and uranium. All right, accelerated radioactive decay, you got helium diffusion. That's the alpha particles that are spit out from a piece of uranium. There's 8 of them during its decay time, all right? They're emitted, the diffusion rate is known. You know how fast helium diffuses through the material. Immeasurable amounts of helium are still found in granites that are purportedly millions of years old. So if you're still seeing helium in there, that ought to tell you something, that maybe it's not as old as they thought it was. And this is basically a zircon. It's a crystal. If you think of zircons, the fake diamonds, that's a zircon, okay? You get a bunch of that, you put it together. It looks pretty neat, but it's not diamond. But basically, from the time you start with uranium-238, if it's inside to get to lead, it emits 8 alpha particles, helium nuclei. And if you still find that in the rock that's supposedly millions of years old, maybe it's not millions of years old. They use the radio. Now, remember, why do they use the long age stuff? Because it gives them long ages, and they need long ages for evolution to occur. But if you see stuff like this happening, you see alpha particles still inside the granite, still diffusing out of the biotite, still diffusing out of the zircons, that means it's still there. That's not a good thing for them, because that tells you that the rocks aren't as old as they thought they were. So can we depend on them? Absolutely not. The dates give different methods and not give consistent results, even for the same material. If you send them the same sample, use different methods to look at them, you get different dates. A good lawyer would get this case thrown out of court right away. So why is it still an issue? Because the non-creation paradigm must have long ages for evolution to occur. If you start looking at this stuff and saying, hey, this stuff is young, then you don't have time, and you need time for evolution. So that's why they like it. So why do they persist in this? Well, we're told about that in Romans. Because they thought, although they knew God, they didn't glorify him as God, nor were they thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. And professing to be wise, they became fools. If absolute dating's not correct, how can we know how old the rocks really are? Genesis 1, 9 and 13, God says, let the waters under the heavens be gathered together in one place, and let the dry land appear, and it was so. So the evening and the morning were the third day. So you know how old the rocks are, day 3 of creation. God said, let the waters under the heavens be gathered together. Whoop, we already did that one. All right. Now the flood was on the earth 40 days, and the waters increased and lifted up the ark and rose high above the earth, and the waters prevailed exceedingly on the earth. All the high hills under the whole heaven were covered. And the waters prevailed on the earth 150 days. So the oldest rocks are about 6,000 years old. That's creation week. That's the oldest rocks. Most of the rest of the sedimentary rocks are flood or post-flood, about 4,500 years old. So how old do you know the rocks are? God's word says at the beginning, 6,000 years ago roughly, that's when the first rocks are. So if you're looking down like in the Grand Canyon, way down at the bottom, the basement rocks, those are 6,000 years old. Most of the rest of the stuff, from the Tapete sandstone, which is the first layer of sedimentary rock, all the way up to Bryce Canyon, 15,000 feet of sedimentary rock. All of that stuff is sedimentary rock, was laid down during the flood. And then he wrote it away. 4,500 years old. So if you want to know how old the rocks are, you got to figure out what was the basement rocks, what's the creation stuff, what's the flood stuff. Now you know how old the rocks are. You don't have to worry about what the radiometric dates or anything like that said. So anyway, there's day 1. Down here in the Precambrian, that's creation rocks. All the rest of this stuff up to here, you got day 40 and day 150. All of this stuff was laid down during the flood. That's 4,500 years old. Everything after that is less than that. So that's how you can tell how old the rocks are. So let's start down here. Creation week is down here. And you got all the flood. And you get way up here at the top, almost at the top of Bryce Canyon, that's the end of the flood. That's where the peak is. So, different radiometric dates give wildly different ages for the same sample. Can't trust them. Krypton argon gates are widely separated basalts, give similar ages. Think about the lava at the top of the Grand Canyon and the diabase cell down at the bottom of the Grand Canyon. All about, according to them, 500 million years old. This stuff has got 500 million years in between the stuff at the bottom and the stuff at the top. They give the same age. There are measurable amounts of helium found in the granites that are purportedly millions of years old, and helium diffusion indicates the rocks are between 5,000 and 6,000 years old when you look at doing the rates on that. So, good enough. We got time for radiocarbon. All right, now that was kind of a fast walkthrough, but when you think about what are the main conclusions from that, if you're using leads or types of date or methods that give you long ages, they want the long ages because if they don't have it, evolution doesn't occur, because evolution needs long ages to go from goo to you by way of the zoo. All right, so you've got from chemicals to the first cell to us, you need a long time for all of that to happen because it's got to be slow and gradual, all right, instead of in the beginning God. So you need that long ages, and so those long age radioisotopes are really helpful. The problem is you can use the same sample, use different methods, and you come up with wildly different answers as to how old things are. But they don't care about the discrepancies as much as they declare that it's nice because it gives you long ages, all right, and they need those. So you find out that if there's still helium in the rocks, then the rocks can't be as old as they say they are. And when they do the diffusion rates and they do the check on that, they find out that the rocks are probably between 5,000 and 6,000 years old. Well, you can't have that, so what do you do with that scientific information? Don't bother me with the facts. My mind is made up. You ignore them. So if you bring that up to somebody, they say, you know, that's just creationist stuff. There's mumbo jumbo, whatever, you know, you're a religious fanatic. All right, so radiocarbon dating is a little bit different. It's created in the upper atmosphere with the interaction of high energy neutrons and nitrogen-14 to make carbon-14. It combines with oxygen to make CO2. It gets absorbed by plants. Animals eat the plants, so the carbon-14 is now in them. When they die, carbon-14, CO2 uptake decreases and carbon-14 begins to decay. So that's the cycle. You start up in the atmosphere, you make carbon dioxide, it gets sucked up by the plants, eaten by the animals, and when they die, now it starts to decay. So here's the whole cycle, basically. It has a half-life of about 5,730 years. This they know this fairly well. It's useful to date materials containing organic carbon out to about 90 to 100,000 years. Measurable amounts of carbon-14 have been found in fossils and coal seams purported to be millions of years old. Millions of years, there should be no carbon-14 in it, okay? Shouldn't be there at all. When plant and animal dies, it ceases, carbon-14 begins to decay. So that's the plan. So, dating coal. This is probably one of the coolest things that the rate guys did, is they took samples from the DOE, their sample bank managed by the Pennsylvania State University, and they sent them out from coal fields all across the United States from supposedly 300 million years old to about 75 million years old, 3 different coal seams. Went from old to middle age to young coal fields. And the samples were sent to a highly respected lab for analysis by accelerator mass spectrometry. It allows for much higher precision in determining the amount of carbon-14. And the 10 samples were found to contain approximately the same amount of carbon-14, indicating that the samples were all approximately the same age. Now, they came up with 44,000 years. Well, that's a whole lot less than millions of years, but it's still kind of a long time. So basically, they got the Pennsylvania, and this is what's called the Carboniferous era in here. That's where most of the coal was formed. And they got the Cretaceous, which is the end of the age of dinosaurs. That's supposedly when they all died out 65 million years ago. And then they got some from the Eocene up here at the top. So they got old, middle, and recent age coal. Now, supposedly, there's 350 million years of time in between those 3 sets of coal. When they analyzed them, they said about the same amount of carbon-14 in each one of them, indicating that they're all about the same age. And if you think about it, down here was the beginning of the flood, and up here was the end of the flood. And during that same year, all of this stuff was ripped up, torn apart, deposited, and buried. And when you look at a coal seam, if you look at it, normally what you see in coal seams is what looks like tree bark. All right? Now, think about what happened at Mount St. Helens. All those trees got ripped off this mountainside and thrown down in the lake, and they were floating around. They're still floating around, beating on each other, and almost all of them are debarked now. And there's about a 3-foot layer of tree bark on the bottom of Spirit Lake, covered by some other stuff that's come in. And what they are looking at is they're seeing the beginnings of carbonization. That's since 1980. Okay, now they haven't got a lot of sediment on top to really bury it and allow it to kind of carbonize on its own, but they've got about a 3 or 4 inch layer of sediment on top of all of this tree bark that's now laying on the bottom of the lake. And it's starting to carbonize a little bit. And if you look at a coal seam, that's pretty much what you see in there. Now, what's the the secular story on how coal gets formed, it was in a swamp. And this stuff just got, dropped down and buried, and eventually it carbonized and turned to coal. Well, that's not what you see in coal seams. You see coal seams, they're thick, there's mud on the top, mud on the bottom, rock on the top, rock on the bottom, and there's nothing in there indicating that there was anything else going on other than something got buried. There's no roots, there's no other layers of sediment or anything in there. Coal seams are pretty much pristine. If you look at peat beds, that's different. Those you see in swamps, and you got, what do you see when you dig, if you get peat and you use it? You got roots, you got dirt, you got all kinds of other stuff in there. That's what you see in peat. You don't see that in coal. Diamonds is another one. Diamonds are supposedly millions of years old. They come from the inside of the earth, and they're thought to originate in the upper mantle at depths up to 90 miles deep, and they're carried to the surface by fast-moving magma. Some of it solidifies into a material called kimberlite. Those are called kimberlite pipes. If they find those, they set up a mine, because that's where you're going to find diamonds, is in the kimberlite. And it's mined in many locations. Here is a South African kimberlite mine. It looks a lot like a coal mine. If you go out west, this is how they strip mine coal. Well, they do the same thing for getting diamonds in South Africa. They find the kimberlite and they mine it to get the diamonds out of it. 12 industrial-grade diamonds from the West and South Africa were sent to a lab for testing. Industrial-grade diamonds are much less expensive than gent-quality diamonds, so they don't feel quite so bad about destroying an industrial-grade diamond than they do one that would be on your finger, okay? So in order to be tested, they used accelerated mass spectrometry. The diamonds had to be destroyed, and the diamond samples contained measurable amounts of carbon-14, dating to about 55,000 years. Oh, that kind of kills the whole paradigm of millions of years for all of this stuff. The dating and stuff that they've done has kind of indicated that this stuff is not as old as they thought it is. I mean, think about coal, 300 million year old coal seam and a 75 million year old coal seam all have the same amount of carbon-14 in it. The fact that it even has measurable carbon-14 is like, they were surprised. They weren't looking for it. They didn't expect to see it. When they found it, it was like, okay, now what do we do? Don't bother me with the facts. My mind is made up. They ignore it. It's sad, but that's true. They got 40 samples of various organic material fossils from the Cambrian, which is down at the bottom, up to into almost the Ice Age. So they sent them out for analysis. The samples encompass the entire geologic column. All the samples contain measurable amounts of carbon-14. More than 90 articles have listed issues where they found carbon-14 in places that they didn't expect to see it. All right? Quote, ancient material, stuff where it shouldn't be. After about 100,000 years, there shouldn't be any carbon-14 anymore. And yet they're finding it in shells from the Cambrian, indicating, Cambrian is probably less than 100,000 years old instead of 550 million. So this is the scientific part of it. They measured the carbon-14 to 12 ratios, and they got an uncorrected age of about 4,700 years. So what do you conclude from that? Well, all the samples of carbon material, shells, wood, coal, bones, contain measurable amounts of carbon-14, which shouldn't be there if it's more than 100,000 years old. Uncorrected dates range between 38 and 55,000 years. When corrected for the flood, guess where they wind up? Just exactly where God said it was. The fossil samples cover the entire geologic column. So, what can we say about that? You can't trust long-age radioactive dates because they give discrepant information for the same sample using a different, if you use uranium, lead, strontium, rubidium, and some of the other long-age ones, you'll get a different date for the same material if you use the same, if you use a different testing method and a different set of isotopes. You'll get different ages, and I mean wildly different ages. If you test volcanics, we saw that when they tested stuff at the top of the Grand Canyon in the bottom of the Grand Canyon, they tested those basalts. They got ages that were pretty much the same between the two of them, and there's supposedly 500 million years of time between those two. When you look at coal seams, they got coal seams that cover about 350 million years of time, according to the secular geologists, that all have measurable amounts of carbon-14, and not only measurable amounts, but the same measurable amounts, indicating that those coal seams are probably all about the same age, indicating that they were deposited about the same time. And if we look at what the Bible has to say, the flood lasted a year. It ripped up the entire surface of the earth and redistributed it. And what we see if we look around, remember when we look back at geology, when we talked about the flood, when you're driving around and you see a road cut, what you see is layer after layer after layer of stuff laid down, and there is no evidence of anything happening in between one layer and the other. And there's supposedly long ages of time between them. There should be evidence of animals, should be evidence of erosion, should be evidence of plant growth, and you don't see that. If you're driving around and you see a road cut, you see one layer after the next, just stacked right on top of each other. When you look at a coal seam, you look at exactly the same thing. You see a layer of dirt, a whole bunch of organic material, and another layer on top of it, and virtually nothing in between. Now, there might be some, what they call polystrate fossils, things like a tree trunk that kind of goes through, and you say, well, that tree trunk maybe grew in place. It didn't. It was part of the conglomeration of stuff that was mixed up and deposited by the flood. If you go to Spirit Lake, and if you can get down to the bottom, you'll see that a whole bunch of those tree trunks have basically tipped up and then grounded on the shore and then got buried by sediment washing in and stuff like that. And it looks like probably 4 or 5 different forests growing in place. If you go to Yellowstone, there's a place called Specimen Ridge. Specimen Ridge has 27 different, quote, forests that were grown in place. But when you look at and you analyze those trees and stuff like that, you don't see roots, you don't see branches. What you see is a trunk stuck in the ground and then buried with a bunch of stuff, and then more trunks. And what you see then is basically a big log mat, and this stuff was just slowly sinking and getting buried. Okay, that's what Specimen Ridge shows you. Initially, they had a sign out there that said this was 27 forests over, I don't know, a couple of 100,000 years. And then when they started getting questions about it and looking at it and saying, well, there's no tree trunks, there's no evidence of anything grown in place, they revised it down and down and down. Now the only sign that's there says this is Specimen Ridge. They took all of that stuff away because it was too embarrassing to try and figure out how do you explain what you actually see based on an old age paradigm which doesn't correlate with it. All right? So what can you learn from radiometric dating? Don't trust the old age stuff because they don't even agree with themselves. They need the old ages for evidence for evolution to occur. When you think about carbon, you find carbon everywhere. From top to bottom, you find measurable amounts of carbon, which shouldn't be there. And that should tell you that the things aren't as old as they think they are. And when you look at the geology, that kind of correlates it, because what you see is layer after layer after layer after layer after layer with no evidence of anything going on the surface of those layers in between one layer and the next layer being laid down. We talked about Nautiloid Canyon. You know, it's a 900-foot thick piece of limestone. They got all these nautiloids in it in the center section, all facing northeast. Why were they all? There was a wave coming at them, and they were like a ship pointing themselves into the wave, and then they got buried. So what you see, if you look around, is evidence of God's judgment. And in spite of all the judgment, we see a lot of beauty. We see a lot of utility that we can use. But we don't see long ages and things happen. What we see is, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. In 6 days, he created everything that we see around us. After about 1,700 years, he judged the earth because of sin with a worldwide flood. And what we see is the evidence of that all around us. So radiometric dating, you can use it to show things are young. But in terms of trying to use it to say things are old, that isn't going to work. It just does not compute. The evidence doesn't support the hypothesis. So we're done.